SEGA Critic, and he's putting a new life and perspective on these SEGA games. And there is no SEGA game, whether it's bad or good, he will tackle. He's gonna break the fourth wall, but 10 times as funnier than most video game critic. He will conquer that series or game that needs more attention, detail, and explanation that he can explain. That's his game of favorite of all time. He will tackle any obstacle that gets in his way. He's willing to travel across dimension, whether it's first party or third party, as long as it's not time travel. He's gonna blast through Green Hills, Fantasy Zone, and Arcadia, and even Dr. Kieran's Mansion. Whether he can make it alive, dead or alive, he's still going to survive and plow through that bullshit. He's going to defeat the greatest villains throughout SEGA history and become a more badass than the nostalgia critic, AVGM, and SEGA vids, whether they praise him or not. He has all the knowledge that he will give new ideas to the SEGA developers who've been over lazy these years. He is the SEGA Critic.
Let's do this. Folks, it's me, the SEGA Critic again. The last time we looked at the SEGA CD, we discussed the good and bad of the SEGA CD. Yeah, I know, the SEGA CD isn't really the best console in the world, of course. It does have a lot of it does consist of a lot of third-party Super Nintendo games that were just enhanced versions of the console. And plus, it did, but for the time, it did offer a lot of PC games which were hit and miss during the time when the SEGA CD was launched back in 1992. And yes, it does have a lot of hilarious FMVs, but I do consider the SEGA CD to be at least, if not one of the most underrated consoles ever, even more underrated than the Sega Saturn. Of course. And plus, they were, like I said in that video, there were some good titles. And plus, some developers like Working Designs and Team Wolf actually took the time to study the hardware and to show the full-on capabilities of the Sega CD, whether it'll be gameplay, audio, and visuals, which adds to the replay value. If you haven't seen my video on why I like the SEGA CD, well, there will be a link in the description. However, though, there is one game on the internet that has been scrounging up through popularity as of lately, since I have been seeing memes on the internet as of recently, both on Twitter and Tumblr. However, though, this game is just almost considered to be one of the worst SEGA CD games and one of the worst SEGA games and video games of all time, and I'm surprised reviewers haven't reviewed it. And that game I'm talking about is Wild Woody. To start out this review, there are a lot of video game reviewers and critics in the media, such as the AVGN, Nostalgia Critic, and Aaron Hansen, who rip off these god-awful bad video games and movies to over-exaggerate and romanticize that product for entertainment value. Sure, the bad video game or movie is usually pure shit or god-awful that it's so bad that it's actually good for sarcastic reason.
But the negative thing about this is that the bad game or movie can be oversold when given a chance, whether you watch that movie or play that said video game. Your expectations will either lower your emotions when you discover it for yourself. Despite Wild Woody being universally panned and disliked by the gaming community and public, I think this game's god-awfulness has been undersold by the public as a whole. But to quote a certain angry video gamer on YouTube, James Roth, there's a difference between seeing shit and playing shit. I will try to point out the game's faults and flaws along the way, but I will not deny that this is probably the worst, not only the worst SEGA game I ever played, the worst 2D platformer I ever played, the worst video game character I ever seen in my life, and worst SEGA character, but this probably has to be the worst video game I ever played in my life, and there are no importance in the gaming media as a whole to the creators and in the public in the past, even in today's society. There are some people who will defend this game objectively, but I will rip this game a new one. So let's kick things off with the history. The plot for Wild Woody may be very simple, but it is the most nauseating, convoluted, and derivative, and the whole thing doesn't make sense for a narrative perspective to the game to give the player a damn whatsoever. The plot is that one day, after a series of events and predictions in a random office that was answered by an answering machine from a call named Debbie Rogers, the totem pole in the center of the random office explodes into 5 pieces and teleports the office into time and space. One of the totem poles is named Lomad, and I'm not kidding. Ooh. He summons a hero, a pencil of all the things, to get 5 pieces of the totem pole and restored, to put them back all together to help pull the universe and shape it back to normal, or else this will happen. There are 2 things that are wrong with this plot. I feel like this plot is more of a coming-of-age story, but rather, this is more of a parody of an episodic road trip fantasy story. For fuck's sakes, you're controlling an anthropomorphic pencil who took too much cocaine in the past 24 hours and snored up his nose. The first con of this story is that there is no central villain or main antagonist to incentivize or to compel the player to give a damn why he or she should collect the 5 pieces of the totem pole to say that game's universe. The game should not only have a character with an appealing personality, but should at least have a relatable connection between the audience and the main antagonist. Should have a dread to the game world and raise the stakes a little and make the player feel more badass to overcome the levels, to push on the desire to fill a scene with pride and defeat to that game, to defeating that game's main antagonist. 2. Wild Woody is just a schizophrenic character who has gone of a sugar cocaine high. Thus, he is thrust into this world with no main villain or setup whatsoever. The reason why the gaming public likes Sonic the Hedgehog is not only because he was a no-nonsense anthropomorphic hedgehog with attitude, but he was supposed to be rebellious. He was supposed to be a rebellious teenager caught in an everlasting epidemic with his friends against a fat communist, evil Theodore Roosevelt lookalike who wanted to change the world and pollute nature with the bad side of technology. Same thing goes with the Blue Bobber Mega Man on stopping an evil Albert Einstein lookalike from his former creator partnership and having a vendetta with his former partner, robots, Dr. Light, and to show the people of the world that there are a bad negative side of robots, to give them a bad reputation against robots and humanoid androids alike to the public, just because main Science Academy rejected his ideas. I'm not saying that Wild Woody should have a serious story like an overbearing RPG like Panzer Dragoon Saga, Skies of Arcadia, and the Final Fantasy series, or some adventure games like Shenmue or The Last of Us. I'm saying that even the most simplest games with a wacky or serious story otherwise should at least have some sort of appeal and an antagonist that we could all hate and loathe, but still having a personality and universe within the game's world. The prime example of this is Rystar. Sure, his character design may be lanky and weird and obtuse, especially for the first-time gamer, but Sega and especially Sonic Team knew about and gave this character a cohesive universe around the game's development, but still having a simple story to bounce off of, whether you're playing the Japanese or US release. The story is still simple. You as Rystar must defeat the evil greedy Kaiser from enslaving and mind-controlling the inhabitants from his evil doing and come peace within the floor of our galaxy. Small but still impactful at the same time with telling a simple story in a platformer game. Also, Rystar's much calmer but curiouser personality has more appeal than Wild Woody's will ever have. Despite Sonic Team borrowing some facial feature from Sonic the Hedgehog off the curious nature and the famous round simple design, they went out of their way to add some voice clips like Rystar saying goodbye and come on when completing the load to add some charm in the game, even though it was hyper compressed to be in the 60-bit cartridge. Same thing can be said with Dynamite Heady. I'm not saying that Sega can have weird, quirky characters, whether it's from a wet dream getting high off the mountains, or by studying dreams, by becoming a therapist. I'm just saying that is when a game series is making a new franchise or IP, should have a contained universe set of characters with the most importantly an antagonist that we could all hate, push the player and the game characters further when defeating that game's antagonist. Like the game Space Channel 5, not only it was just a colorful rhythm-based game that features Michael Jackson, but it also has the character Ulala team up with her friends and rivals to stop the threat of Mr. Blank and Purge from Spaceport 9 and stop them from taking over the universe. Why Woody should at least have some sort of main threat of an antagonist, and why we should collect the 5 pieces of the magic totem pole. If there were to have some sort of villain or an antagonist, I would call that villain El Pacho Lucifer. El Pacho was the world's greatest artist, but then he got jealous because his work was being overshadowed and obscured by new underground artists. One day, he got depressed and got the message from an answering machine from his friend named Debbie, and ignored strange occurrence and frustratingly makes him knock down his totem pole, which he got as a souvenir at a local art convention, not realizing he threw it across the room throughout the paintings Super Mario 64 style. He entered that set painting, and just like Maximus the Mad lineage from the Inhuman comics, he mind controls, enslave, and trick the inhabitants in that painting world and treat him like he was some sort of god. Next, you know, Lomad summoned his magic pencil, tells him what's up, and that's where the real adventure begins. And you see how easy that was when setting up the game with a main antagonist whatsoever? And it didn't even take that long. And I know what you're all are saying, but SEGA Critic, there's already a narrative within the game's manual. I know, but this is just an NES standard of storytelling. This was a late release Sega CD game. It could at least have some cutscenes in that game's universe and an antagonist right off the bat, just like games like Pop for Mel and KO's Flying Squadron, which had
better well-constructed plots than this game. There was no excuse for SEGA Multimedia Studios to rush out this game's story. Oh yeah, P.S. SEGA did mix up the table consonants that if you were playing a Sega Saturn game instead of a Sega CD game, but I just want to mention that. As for Wild Woody's character, he has no influence on the gaming public or importance whatsoever. His character is trying way too hard to be loud, edgy, and insane just for the hell of it. Due to this game's story, cutscene presentation, and voice acting. Not only there are some bad CGI cutscenes that will make Reboot, the Max Steel cartoon from the early 2000s, and the Donkey Kong Country cartoon blush, but the way that Woody talks is just plain nerve-wracking, and the voice actor Joe Kasha, the voice of Wild Woody, is just using his regular voice when he speaks calmly, but when there's a crazy part in the cutscene story, felt like his voice director tells him to scream on top of his lungs like an insane maniac who took too much cocaine and crack. I know it's common for some voice actors to use their normal voice for some characters in some specific shows, movie, and video games. And I also know that there are some characters who are directed to have that character to have a loud, squeaky voice with booming energy. But there is one rule to all of this in voice acting in general. That is vocal range. Yes, sure, Kevin Conroy and the rest of the DCAU cast in their prospective show uses their regular voice. But if there is a dramatic scene, tension, or death situation, you could really feel that emotion from the characters.
Do I look like I'm playing games?
What are you gonna do to me?
I'm gonna punch a hole in your head.
We don't do that to our enemies.
Speak for yourself.
I'm trying to speak for Superman.
Same thing can be said with some voice actors providing a loud, high-pitched, squeaky voice, like the life of Rob Paulson, of course.
But this hand, it's still here.
I don't care about your stupid letter.
But I didn't give it to Santa. I forgot to give it to Santa Claus. I didn't give him the letter. It's very, very important.
Give me that stupid letter. Now throw the switch when the meter hits red.
I'm assuming the voice box is Adriana Romano is pretty much having a hard time going through SEGA Studio back in 1994, and she said this.
Whoa, hang on a second. You want me to direct this character like that person went out of insane asylum and he just became an insane lunatic and he just snorted about a bunch of cocaine? Fuck this. I'm going to Warner Brothers to work on the next superhero show.
I would rather hear the mediocre voice acting from Mega Man 8, Star Fox 64, the original Resident Evil, Castlevania Symphony of the Night, Sonic Adventure 1, and even the mid-90s anime English dub from the mobile Kenchi series.
Ryoko, now, I want you to listen to me. I'm about to do something you could tease me about later, and I'm warning you not to.
Yeah, whatever.
Don't say I didn't warn you. It's for your own good. My mommy!
Little Ayeka.
Oh, mommy!
Ayeka.
Oh, so good to see you, mommy!
She's calling her Mommy! I think so. Please let me go. Let me go.
I did warn you. Sesame? Here, read this.
Okay. I'm sorry, pretty young lady.
Oh. Okay. That's more like it.
I know some of those 4 games that I mentioned are from the mid to late 90s, but the voice acting in those games
is at least not as ear-raping for the most part, unlike freaking Wild Woody. Hell, the voice acting from Pop Full Mail and KO's Flying Squadron, Dark Wizard, and some Working Designs RPGs cutscenes was much better and tolerable. And hell, this was being on the same console as this game. Also, Woody consistently breaks the fourth wall in the game's story cutscene and points on the obviously that wacky situation or jokes like other bad famous video game characters like Bubsy the Bobcat. And also, here's a clip on what John Tron meant by when games suddenly break the fourth wall, but you gotta still make the universe believable.
Truly ironic. A game designer's job, in most cases, is to create a living world that ceases to be fake in the mind of the player. I mean, think about it. Even if the game constantly breaks the fourth wall like in Duke Nukem or Monkey Island, the world is still believable. Your suspension of belief kicks in, and your mind allows you to meld with the game environment as if you were actually there. When a game like Bubsy 3D makes self-referential humor, it just seems foolish. Having the designers of this game refer to themselves as designers, something just feels wrong about it. Game theory time!
The more you know.
I consider this game overall to have the worst story and presentation, to be the weakest part of the game in general. If you thought the story gotten bad, the aesthetics are even worse. And what I have heard is that the game's graphics is supposed to be in vein of DKC's 1 and 2, but if you ask me, the art style and graphics are similar to another video game classic, Earthworm Jim, seeing how I would rather play this game than this pile piece of shit. While Earthworm Jim's art style was a tribute to most classic cartoons like Looney Tunes, Tom and Jerry, and Tex Avery cartoons that were still re-showing on television and various cartoon stations and network out at the time to this day, while Woody's art style is trying way too hard to be like most surreal gross-out cartoons like Ren and Stimpy, Rocko's Modern Life, and even Beavis and Butthead, but in video game form. I really don't mind this style, but I wish it had more execution to the game's dull color palette. In other words, that while Woody himself and the rest of the enemies and bosses are just plain creepy, Sega Multimedia Studios just used stock footage for the bosses, and they even tried to use 2D hand drawing sprites that was just drawn by a 5-year-old. I know games like Lunar 1 and 2, Pop for Mail, and KO sometimes have generic art sprites as well, but later on these games you could at least appreciate the beautiful game aesthetic and its charm along the way. Even games like Astral had more beautiful like style 2D aesthetics and graphics for a 2D platformer in 1995. And that game was a launch title for the Sega Saturn, which was much more powerful than the Sega CD. Hell, Wonder Dog uses the same Tex Avery-ish Ren and Stimpy Looney Tunes style in its game. It was way much more colorful and appealing, and that was a launch title game for the Sega CD back in 1992. The game may have its unique themes to back it up, like the pirate theme all the way to the hellish graveyard cemetery level, but this game is lacking a strong color palette and contrast and brightness. Besides the first two pirate levels and Mount Olympus in the second act of the Greek mythology level, the rest of the color contrast and palettes consist of browns, generic puke vomit green, and melancholy silver and purple colors in the rest of the game, such as stages like the first act of the Minotaur's Maze in the Greek mythology level, factory level, and the science fiction space level. The color scheme is trying way too hard to be dark and edgy, given that the time this game was released, and mix it up with its episodic road trip fantasy aesthetics in the mix. But the art style in this game is just depression, muted, and jank beyond belief. Yeah, Natsushima had a hard time creating a different hard vision what a Sonic
one sequel should be. Hence, that some of the levels were rehashed in Sonic CD. But to give that game credit, it was a hell of a lot colorful and more appealing than Wild Woody itself. I would rather play Alice in Wonderland for the Game Boy Color and The Wizard of Oz for the Super Nintendo than Wild Woody for a 2D platformer that's supposed to have a quote-unquote epic Sonic road trip fantasy aesthetic and having to deal with this game's art style and aesthetic. Well, as for the music, let's put a pin on that later. That being said, let's move on to the gameplay. The gameplay for Wild Woody is basically a 2D platformer where the goal is to get from point A to point B to progress in different ancient time periods from painting to paintings, Viva with cutscenes, 2 acts, and a final boss at the end, just like the Sonic games. And each act has its quirkily own name, kind of like the ones in Earthworm Jim and the Donkey Kong Country trilogy. But the level design feels like the bad negative parts from Sonic CD and Sonic 2 Slappy's level design. What I mean is that the godlike, messy, sloppy level design, like from stages like Metallic Madness Zone, Act 2, Wacky Workbench, Tidal Tempest, and even Metropolis Zone, under perspective games from Sonic CD and Sonic 2. Navigating the horizontal level design, like in the first act of the Greek mythology level, Minotaur's Maze, and the 2 acts of the science fiction levels, Alien Homeworld and Invitation, are the most disorganized levels I have ever played in a 2D platformer since the original Metroid on NES. Sure, there are arrows pointing in the right directions to guide the player where the goal is, but the sheer non-linear level designs makes me want to play something that's more straightforward, like Castlevania 3, Ghosts and Goblins, the 6 classic Mega Man games on NES, or heck, even the first Alex Kidd game on Sega Master System. I don't mind a little exploratory 2D level design in my 2D platformers to hunt down goodies and to find the fastest shortcut when replaying that game. But what I'm saying is that there has to be some sort of sense of direction in a 2D platformer standards for both 2D and 3D platformer standards when traveling around to go from point A to point B in your goal-based platforming game. Complain what you will about the early classic 3D Sonic games having unstructured level design in most of the bad parts of the game. Sure, those earlier games had a rocky start, especially Sonic 2 and Sonic CD, but sooner on, the later developers from Sonic Team and Sega Technical Institute between the years of 1991 and 1993 learned that most players don't want to get confused or lost when trying around the game, or let's say get bored when going through a straight linear path and repetitive. That's why Sonic 3 and Knuckles feels the best of both worlds when, let's say, leads to a person who loves exploratory level design like myself, or a person who just wants to play the game casually at a linear romp. But the 3 levels in Wild Woody has to be the most gimmicky levels I have played and fails for the most part. The Minotaur Maze tries to be like the pipe maze world from Super Mario Bros. 3, where you have to enter and exit out of pipes viva by the stage, teleporters, vases. But in actuality, this stage reminds you too much of Ground Savage's stage from Mega Man X6 and the teleporting gimmick from Astro Man stage from Mega Man 8, where every time you jump into these vases and hit the down button on your control pad, it will instantly warp you in a random part of the stage, but you don't know where the fuck to go and where you're at all times. While the 2 science fiction levels are basically the same thing, but with an added puzzle gimmick by hitting switches at the end of the door to activate some platforms to progress. But you don't want to enter the same door twice, or else you're stuck with this game's god-awful gravity gimmick. I know this stage is supposed to be a parody of most science fiction tropes in a post-apocalyptic setting, but for fuck's sakes, this is not a level that I wouldn't replay in my entire life when it comes to post-apocalyptic settings or space settings in a platforming game.
Yes, Woody does have the ability to teleport into pipes, just like the 2D Mario games, but in vases and boxes and other containers. But the game's teleporting mechanics makes Nightcrawler, Blinks from the X-Men facepalm so hard, and that they have a nosebleed, and Lockjaw from the Inhumans stick his head in the ground. If you thought the gimmicky level design was bad, the worst is the platforming. When it comes to levels that move vertically, like Mount Olympus from Act 2 of the Greek mythology level, and running around the hellish catacombs of Act 2 of the Gothic Cemetery level, Woody has a hard time making his mark on platforming and not having a fully jump, which all 2D platformers should have to correct mistakes when hopping from platform to platform with a traditional glide and hovering mechanic as a momental bonus in some areas of the level design. This makes the platforming in Wild Woody more pain in the ass to navigate in levels, especially when doing some precision platforming. Also, this applies to the combat when you're trying to jump on and defeat some enemies. You will need to, and I'm not kidding, rub them out. Ooh. This game controls way too similar to the bullshit platforming and combat used in games like The Wizard of Oz for the SNES and Alice in Wonderland for the Game Boy Color. And didn't I mention that this game has fall damage like the Bubsy games? Whoa, dude, you better not be talking about my favorite game of all time, Wild Woody!
Whoa. Who's the hell interrupted my video? 90s Mike?
Yeah, that's right, dude. I'm the one who interrupted your video. My name is 90s Mike. And I want to introduce myself to all the dudettes and dudes on the internet. Forget about what those professional reviewers have to say about some of their retro games and compare it to modern games and things out in the media of modern times. I'll value anything that was cool and awesome back in the 90s, even the shitty games and movies. I heard you saying smack talk on Wild Woody, and believe it or not, Wild Woody is like one of my favorite games of all time, right next to Bubsy. Those games had more pill, and they were more exciting, more innovative than that pesky blue hedgehog. Also, I heard you say something about smack talk about my two favorite movie license games, Alice in Wonderland and The Wizard of Oz on the Super Nintendo and Game Boy Color.
Yeah, sure, 90s Mike. I like the 90s as much as the next person, but I will admit, not everything from that decade is perfect, especially the middle part of the decade when everything was becoming in 3D. And of course, we also had the Bubsy games.
Ugh. I remember seeing those movies back in the mid to late 90s on Disney Channel and on TBS, well before they had those god-awful new episodes of American Dad and those crappy reruns. And then I remember watching the commercial and reading Nintendo Power to see that we have a game. I had to go out and rush and buy it. To me, those are the best two movie license games I have ever played. Not only they follow the movie, they have some great, awesome, innovative gameplay and new gimmicks that the gaming industry haven't seen before. As for comparing why...
Okay then, is there any deadbeat who's willing to freaking romanticize on how angelic the past is while being nostalgic about their favorite decade and not thinking about the flaws as it is? Okay then, let's continue with the review.
The only two levels I like from this certain game are the two factory levels and the first act of the Gothic Cemetery level, because not only the gimmicks are less annoying than the other levels, but the level design takes a back seat on exploration and just becomes a standard linear romp throughout the level. Also, the Gothic cemetery level aesthetic does remind me of a certain Tim Burton in movies like Beetlejuice and Nightmare Before Christmas. The monsters like skeleton dog enemies remind me of Poopsie from the Beetlejuice cartoon, and the bouncing zombified Elvis enemies kind of look like Muscle Man's dad from Regular's show. As for the power-ups in this game, they're kind of finicky. Some power-ups, like the opera singer, will actually clear out some levels, while other power-ups will enhance Woody's combat and platforming abilities. Out of all these power-ups I like, the only ones I like are the platforming-centric power-ups, like for example, the rocket jetpack in the factory and science fiction space levels, and the ghost power-up in the Gothic cemetery level. After Woody is done using a power-up, Woody would turn himself Mizrai for a brief second to get to those hard-to-reach areas you can't reach and small gaps, until you get the sketch pad. One of them has a pencil sharpener icon, and Woody grows into normal size, if you know what I mean. Ooh. The bosses, if I can even call them bosses, are just generic statues that just sit there with a big weak point on the top of the spot. These bosses don't attack you or harm you in any way, besides drawing projectiles in Woody's face. You're gonna have a harder time with these controls than attacking the bosses. These bosses are pretty much like the bosses from Ocarina of Time, minus the 6th boss, Twin Manova, where they have a glowing eye or weak spot where you have to hit them 3 times with a much more powerful weapon, and that's it. Hell, the bosses from Nights into Dreams are more appealing into this. Heck, Jackal and Claws at least had to change up their strategy when you end up attacking them, whether you're using the paraloop mechanic or not. Throughout the levels, you will find these red puzzle pieces hidden in areas that will take you to a bonus level. If you collect them all, Woody is whisked away by a high-definition 16-bit Mode 7-like maze, similar to the special stages of the Sonic CD. Here you'll grab extra lives, sketch power-ups to add to your inventories and other things. These bonuses are honestly the best part of the game because after going through the shitty 2D platforming areas with crappy controls, you go through a Pac-Man-like 3D maze. It's like the developers were saying, if you like the acid trip stages from Sonic CD, then you have to try Wild Woody's, yo!
Whoa, those bonus levels look highly advanced even on my favorite console, the SEGA CD. Hey, these bonus levels are way better than the ones you see on Sonic CD. To tell you the fact, they're way better than Blues Baron. God, is there anything I like about this game?
Oh yeah, there is one thing. The music!
Yes, you heard me right. The music is the best part of the game, and seeing how this is what you expect on a Sega CD hardware, the music has to be the most high quality, balls to the walls, the greatest thing that you heard. But this game's going even further than that by using the virtual audio sound, which Capcom use a lot for their arcade titles and fighting games that was used during the mid-90s. Also, Sega would take advantage of virtual sound for their upcoming console of that year, the Sega Saturn. This is surprising because some Sega CD games will actually use a high quality Red Book audio tune. However, Wild Woody soundtrack has to be the most phenomenal thing that I ever heard in my book. Wild Woody was composed by Ron Taj, aka Bumblefoot from Guns N' Roses fame, and this soundtrack is very rock and roll inspired centric. It's more of a personalized soundtrack, what you will, to sell on the crazy antics of what Woody would do in these crazy situations in these stages. And this was before Sega hires the likes of Jun Sonoy and Crust 40 in the early 3D Sonic. Just like Sonic Adventure 2, Wild Woody has all types of rock-centric genre of music varieties,
up to the ass that you can't help to enjoy. You got the generic Metallica industrial rock that plays in the Greek mythology stages and the second act of the factory stages and some of the boss fights with some opera pieces and the 3D Mode 7 effect in the bonus stages. But you also have neoclassical rock and the pipe organ in the Gothic Cemetery stages with a mix of jazz, rock, funk in the pirate stages, factory stages, and some soft universal rock in the space futuristic sci-fi levels. Even though rock music ain't my taste when it comes to visual variety in video games as a whole, I would rather much have more of an environmental soundtrack than a personalized soundtrack in this game, as long as there are different varieties of music that makes the instrumental variety great and not repetitive, kind of like Sonic Adventure 2, then I'm all good. Again, I would rather much have music that's more emotional, that surrounding the game and movie's environment, but in some cases, just like Sonic Adventure 2, I could tolerate it while I wouldn't because it kicks so much ass. Bumblefoot only had a month to do the soundtrack, and he had to do a rush job and get it delivered within Sega before, the Sega Saturn's lifespan started and the Sega CD ended during that time. And if you don't believe me, here's an interview.
I think they sent me a CD that had some kind of multimedia on it for me to look at, and I needed to just get a vibe for the game, so I was like, pirate ship stuff. I was thinking just very bouncy yo-ho-ho kind of things. And for the mechanical stuff, things that were a little more industrial sounding. Cemetery, very neoclassical. So it was really the themes of the game itself that I was using to guide how I was going to make the music. I had to... There were 28 pieces of music, maybe more, and I had a month to do it, so that meant every day I had to have a song for that video game written, recorded, and on a cassette in the mail to the West Coast, to those guys to check out and make sure it was cool. And so after everything was done, I flew out to the studios in San Francisco, and we tracked stuff with the drummer for a day, and then we started mixing. And they had this one gadget that they wanted to use. And this was before surround sound and things like that, but they had this thing that made it feel like surround sound. It would make the audio, whatever you put through it, sound like it was spiraling around the room, going left to right, but also sort of forward and backward, away from you and toward you. So they wanted to use that on a few things, so we did that. And spent 2 days just fooling around and mixing and getting it all together.
Even though I had a tough time with the game's control, platforming, and clunky combat and level design, at least there was some badass music I could listen to during this game.
Rock on, dude!
Ah, spoiler alert!
Also, the ending is not very rewarding in my eyes. After Woody gets all the 5 pieces in the mini totem pole, Low Man tells him that Woody can make whatever wish he please. If you manage to collect all the puzzle pieces in the bonus levels, Woody's wish is that he wished he had a paintbrush as his girlfriend. Now let's discuss on what is the real creators and the developers of why Woody is upon this game. I think Woody is flat to become more of a 2D platformer game of the minds of Digital Pictures and not SEGA Multimedia Studios. Just think about it for a sec. Both has lousy presentation and surreal
off-the-wall stories and plots. And the only importance that these games have in the gaming industry is that their quality is so bad that it's actually good, and having gameplay that's tolerable but not as polished. Even then, most DP games usually have a villain or antagonist to motivate the story along within the game. Wild Woody, both gameplay and story structure was rushed to meet a deadline in late 1995 to have Sega fans and players who still didn't own a Sega Saturn during the time to get that last bit of success of the Genesis and the Sega CD back in September of 1995. I will admit though, Sega did try their last-ditch effort, and it does quote-unquote surprise me on that they managed to add virtual sound and a good presentation to this game by adding CGI cutscenes of what the Saturn was going to do proceeding of that year to showcase on what the Saturn was capable of, but let's translate it to the Sega CD as a late Sega CD game. Wild Woody's appeal in the 90s generation of teens and adults were already established, like characters like Sonic the Hedgehog and other Sega characters, both on their storytelling, personality, and gameplay without trying too hard. Don't get me wrong, this game is a guilty pleasure of mine, but there is another Sega game that actually does this concept well, and that game is Comic Zone for the Sega Mega Drive / Genesis. There, you also too have to control a main character that jumps through pictures through his own comic book to save that game's universe, but Comic Zone had more of an established villain, which gave the player the incentive to give a damn to save his own comic. The character Sketch Turner has more of an appealing importance as a whole in the gaming industry, and for a 2D methodical beat-em-up, it's actually a pretty good game with slight 2D platforming and puzzle elements. I won't deny that this game has flaws, especially the final boss, for example, but for a late Sega Genesis game, it has more stimulus gameplay and more appealing and structure and importance than Wild Woody would ever have. Wild Woody's story was rushed, and even then it didn't have a villain to give player to give a damn to say that game's universe and world compared to most simplest of games like Rise Star or Dynamite Heady. The platforming and combat controls are wonky and stiff to the player, at least some sort of enjoyment, and the level design and aesthetics is just too surreal and episodic road trip fantasy to my taste, especially when Woody just jumps into those paintings. But it fails on the concept between game narrative and gameplay as a whole, and Woody constantly breaking the fourth wall just really gets on my nerves, especially in cutscenes. The only good thing I have to say is about this game is the music. Yeah, sure, it's just mainly generic rock and roll, but however, with this personalized soundtrack, the guy who did this, Ron Taj, the drummer of Bumblefoot, knew what he was doing, and he actually added some variety of rock, including from the generic to industrial to mechanical, which makes it the almost tolerable thing I could stand for in this game, and the soundtrack is pretty badass. Kind of like Sonic Adventure 2, even though the soundtrack is not my cup of tea, at least the variety of rock helps my mind stay stimulated and makes me zone out to the music while playing the game, which gets a pass on my book by still having catchy melodies along the way. I have to give Wild Woody a C rank.
I find it kind of ironic seeing how with Sega's Wild Woody that there's a character also named Woody in the Toy Story series, and I find it kind of oblivious to believe that, this game, Wild Woody, came out in September of 1995, and Toy Story came out like 2 years later. Not only that, Universal also had a character named Woody as their mascot, Woody Woodpecker. I find it even more surprising that Sega Multimedia Studios or Digital Pictures, whoever developed this game, never had a copyright dispute or lawsuit whatsoever. Well, like I said, this game is a guilty pleasure. Like, I do somewhat like the 90s cheesiness, and I do somewhat get a laugh out of when discussing about the game CGI cutscenes, but I laugh at the cutscenes but not with the game, because let's face it, the CGI is just terrible. As for the aesthetics, it just tries way too hard to be a mixture between Donkey Kong Country with the extremeness of Sonic the Hedgehog with the cartoony wackiness of Earthworm Jim. Because, you know, pre-render visuals from Donkey Kong Country are way much better, and the cartooniness extreme in Sonic and Earthworm Jim is just... those games are just way better. But if you're curious, you could play the game. Sadly though, this game is going up to $200, but recently though, it has been dipping down to $50 because I guess people are just sick and tired of it, and they really realize how bad this game is. But if you see my Sega CD review, my Sega CD retrospective, you might as well just emulate the game. And maybe, hey, if you have yourself a good computer, put yourself an HDMI wire to one of your TV, and basically set up the emulator. Invite some friends, if you could invite some friends during these times, and basically have a laugh at it.
Oh, dude, you actually like the game?
Not in your dreams, motherfucking Mike.
Fuck this game! 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 Fuck this game!
God, is there any good Sega CD representation as of lately? I mean, we could have at least got a decent Sega CD mascot besides maybe Metal Sonic or the Blue Hedgehog on Sonic CD. Like, we could at least got a decent ass mascot to represent the Sega CD. The closest thing that we got is freaking Rami from KO's Flying Squadron during the time. Seriously, is there not any Sega character to represent the Sega CD other than Sonic the fucking Hedgehog?
Oh my god, actual effort! It's actual effort!
That's the end of my video. I hope you enjoyed. Please hit that like button and subscribe. And hit that little bell icon if you want to see more of me, the SEGA Critic. Also, donate to my Patreon. It's only $1 if you want to get a mention and thank you throughout the video when it officially comes out on YouTube. And $5 if